was like, oh, wow.
Right. So we're going to look today at Viktor Frankl and his essay, The Case for a Tragic Optimism. So again, the things I say right now, and it'll be short, it won't be anything like the Socrates lectures. It will be on the test. So a lot of what I say right now is going to be on the test. And a lot of what I say right now is not going to appear necessarily in the text either. There's going to be some corollaries, but you'll see what I mean when I talk about that. In short, Viktor Frankl, 1905 to 1997. So yeah, long life, man, 92 years. He did live a life. And it's quite amazing what it is that he did do during his life. He survived a concentration camp. He was picked up in Germany, and he was held by the Nazis in Auschwitz-Dachau, which, if any of you guys remember studying World War II, you did not survive Auschwitz-Dachau. My grandfather actually was in Auschwitz, and so he did survive, but that was very much towards the end of the war. Frankl was in the concentration camp for 3 years, man. Yeah, and so to survive 3 years in a concentration camp, it's worthwhile listening to this guy to figure out some things that he might know about survival. And so he ends up, when he's liberated from the concentration camp, he's essentially experiencing this thing that most of the world is experiencing, especially Europe is experiencing at the time, which is this complete loss of faith. You understand that Darwin's Origin of the Species published 19th century, and so for little bit by little bit, science has been leveling this absolutely savage criticism against religion, and it's a savage criticism. It is. There's a lot to say there, and so Europe is struggling with this idea of whether or not there's meaning in life, and especially this idea of God. So even people who were religious beforehand, you look at the world, and it's difficult not to question that kind of thing. And I'm sure a lot of you guys question this thing now. So you've got this thing called theodicy. I'll write it here. Theodicy is essentially the study of evil, and especially how is it that God can exist within evil. So when we think of there being such a thing as a God, what are some things that God would have to be in order to be God? Omniscient, yeah, which means?
Knowing all.
Yeah, it has to know everything. So God has to know everything. Right? What else does God have to be? Omnipotent, yeah. To be all-powerful. To be able to do anything. Omni means all. So science means knowledge. So all-knowing, potent, powerful. So to be all-knowing, all-powerful. And there's one other thing that we think of as God being. The warm, fuzzy side. All-loving, yeah. Omnibenevolent. If you want to keep with the omnis. So God has to be all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful. There's a problem here. Moms die of cancer. Kittens get hit by cars. And holocausts happen, and wars happen. And so the struggle is here. So let's say that God is all-knowing. Okay? If he's all-knowing, then he knows the Holocaust is happening. He knows that World War II is happening. If he's all-powerful, he could stop it. He could stop the suffering. But Holocausts happen. World War II happened. And so it kind of calls into question then, does he really love us then? Or you might say, no, God loves us. And God knows it's happening, but then you have a problem. Maybe he's just not powerful enough to stop it. Or maybe he cares, maybe he could stop it, but he's distracted right now. He doesn't even know what's happening. He's not paying attention to us very closely. So the idea is that you've got these three things that God is supposed to be, but it seems clear that those things don't exist. And so because of this, we think of it being evil in the world. Now again, a distinction between tragedy and evil that we were making earlier. So in this case here, there's evil, there's tragedy even, that exists in the world. And so there's a problem here. And so when you're looking at the destruction that comes after a war, it's easy to look around and go, really, if there's a God, how come 11 million people died in these concentration camps? 6 million of his supposed chosen people died. How could a loving God allow that to happen? Maybe he wasn't strong enough to stop it. Maybe he didn't even know. In which case, is God deserving of our worship? And so it creates this massive crisis in faith that you have. And so there's a perfect little storm almost that coincides with it, where you've got these early psychotherapists, you've got Freud, you've got Jung, you've got Adler, and you've got these guys who kind of step in, and they just happen to be the right people at the right time, where they're developing psychology and trying to develop this idea of how is it that we can have some sort of meaning and purpose and all that outside of religious convictions. And they're trying to explain away how it is that World War II and things like that could have happened. Because we think of World War II and just be like, oh man, that was the pinnacle of it all. I mean, 11 million people died in concentration camps. Stalin saw that, and he was like, hold my vodka. And he killed somewhere between 30 and 50 million people in the Soviet Union. And then, Mao Zedong saw that, and he was like, wow, that's pretty hard to overcome, but I'm going to do it. And Mao Zedong was responsible for the death of between 70 and 90 million people. I think I was talking to you guys before where I had a debate one time with a professor, this is a few years ago when I was at Pasadena City College, and we were arguing about these political systems, and I made the comment that Mao Zedong was responsible for the death of 70 to 90 million people. And this professor very adamantly interrupted me and said, excuse me, that is a lie. There's no evidence that he was responsible for more than the death of 50. Okay, 50 million. Fine. Even that's enough for you to sit there and be able to say, well, I'm going to defend him anyway. So anyway, there's this idea that if you believe, like I was saying before, that there's nothing special and unique and inherently necessary about people, then what's the difference between the death of 50 million and 90 million? As Stalin said, the death of one person is a tragedy, the death of a million people is a statistic. And so we're struggling to come to grips with this kind of thinking that's occurring. And so these early psychotherapists, psychoanalysts, they step into that void there. And Frankl is one of these. He gets out of Auschwitz, and he later on becomes a psychiatrist, neuropsychiatrist, sorry. And he starts to understand how it is that we can have meaning and purpose in life, even if there's no such thing as a God. So what we're looking at is not necessarily the exclusion of a God. In other words, if you believe and you have faith, that's fine. And if you have faith, by the way, meaning and purpose is pretty easy to come by. I'm going to keep going through this tragedy. Why? Well, because God's testing me. God wants something better for me. God's got something better for me on the other side of this. You have meaning. You have purpose. Well, if you don't believe that stuff, well, then it's very difficult. What do? Oh, I'm suffering, and I'm suffering needlessly. I'm suffering for stuff, especially that isn't even my fault. I'm suffering because there's something that's just inherently wrong with the world and the structures around it. And that's a hard thing to overcome, to keep going through. So Frankl was looking at how it is that we can develop a system of meaning psychologically that's not just arbitrary, it's not just made up out of nowhere, that there's something deeply human about it and deeply understandable about this. And so he's kind of coming through. So we begin with this kind of main question, which is like how to maintain meaning in any circumstance. So how to maintain meaning in any circumstance is what he's primarily concerned with.
When I was on my acid trip, everything had a meaning behind everything.
This is why people would, really advocate the use of psychedelics.
But I mean,
by the way, I'm not.
Steve Jobs did.
Just saying, but no, because it makes you ultra sensitive and awakens certain parts of your brain that become alert to those kinds of things. And people argue and say, everything has a meaning, but you just don't know what it is. We haven't found it yet. But that there is a meaning to find. And so this is why people who use psychedelics will tell you a lot of times that meaning, like, you start to see how everything is connected, and all of those things kind of come together. But don't do drugs, right?
yeah, don't do
Okay,
it.
good.
Unless
Don't do drugs.
No problem.
It's for the camera.
Oh, you were rolling?
No, I was looking at the camera and said, don't do drugs. So anyway, this idea of how it is that we can maintain meaning in any circumstance. And that's an important thing when he's talking about any circumstance here, because think about the worst circumstance that you can imagine yourself being in. Frankl was talking about having been in a concentration camp for 3 years. So if you're like, I'm really hungry, I've only got $2. I'm hungry and I have no money. Or, growing up and you have holes in the soles of your shoes. That sucks, especially if you're living around a bunch of wealth. It does suck. It's not to diminish what you're going through. But this guy was talking about Oh, you have a hole in your shoe. That sucks. That's cool. You have a shoe though. Yeah, it was a concentration camp. We didn't have shoes. Oh, okay. It's like talking to your grandfather, but he actually went through it. What he's saying he went through the concentration camp. And so he's trying to figure out how we can maintain meaning in these circumstances. But he's also writing about this, not just to people who are suffering in that kind of a thing, but he acknowledges that there's a different kind of existential suffering that we're going through. In his case, the 20th century, but man, it translates perfectly over to the 21st century, which is this idea that like material comfort has created a problem within us. And that's what he calls the existential vacuum. Come on. The existential vacuum. Yeah. And again, the idea here is that this is caused essentially by material comfort. So right now, so let's say that, for example, you're living 300 years ago, or 200 years ago, even 100 years ago, really. What are your primary concerns in life? Living. Yeah, surviving. Yeah, you got to get food, clothing, you have to have shelter, and that takes up a lot of your time. As we were looking at a few weeks ago, let's say that we're talking. If you remember the quote about we don't know what to do with our time except for waste it. The idea there is that when we, if you have to wash your clothes, and you just throw in a washing machine and stand there for 22 minutes, even if you got to smell the crap in the sink, at least it's over pretty quickly. Now, what do I do with the rest of my day? It used to take you an entire day to do something like that. Now we have a whole bunch of extra time. And so material comfort has separated us from that constant, needing to overcome and strive and survive. So now we actually have time to think about certain things. And in fact, it even creates these problems that we have where now I might have a washing machine, but that guy's got a better one. And that bothers me. I might have a car, I don't have to walk to work anymore, but somebody else has a nicer car. And so it creates these kinds of problems, and a lot of we associate that most of the time with just our existence itself, life itself. My life is the things that I have, these possessions. And so he argues that this kind of material comfort has created this existential vacuum, which is, essentially what it means is that we used to work off of things like instinct, In other words, we just kind of trust our instinct. We worked off of instinct, something almost animalistic in us. Tradition, we could trust in our old traditions, but we can't trust our instincts anymore. We can't trust our traditions anymore because of this advent of science and is overcoming the religious nature of people, and our instinctual selves, our almost primal selves, are being overcome now. And so these old systems no longer work. And so now you're kind of left out there with nothing to go by. It's not too far off of what you guys experience right now. Now, listen to you guys talking. We discuss things like truth, and there's always this thing of like, well, there's your truth, and there's my truth, and there's that truth. But man, if we really believe that, then what do you hang your head on in the universe if there's no such thing as truth? It creates this kind of nihilism that there's nothing that's really worth struggling for, because, would you really struggle for a truth if it's not like a real truth? If you could just change it minute by minute, there's nothing really to struggle and fight for. Not necessarily meaning we should just pick fights with people because we have different views. But that means there's nothing that's really held close to you in these ways. So tradition is gone, instinct is gone. And so we're essentially left with two possibilities. We've got conformism, which is what it sounds like. It's conformity. And conformity is essentially that we want to do what others do. We wish to do what others do. We wish to do what others do. Many of you should know what I'm talking about here. You take your Instagram pictures and you sit there and you do the whole look on your face. Like the whole miserable, sad, staring off in the distance face. And you see so many people doing it. That should tell you something. Obviously, it's not yours. So why do you do it? Oh, because I like the way it looks. Fine. But that's what that is. It's you wishing to do what other people are doing. Why? Because it fits in, And people sticking weird cups and things in their lips so that you can look like Kylie. It's conformism. And again, it isn't necessarily that there's something horrible about it. But it's funny because if I tell you, oh, you're just conforming, we do have a visceral reaction against that. So there's something inside of us that tells us that's a bad thing to do. We don't like the idea that we're conformists. So it creates this tension inside of us. Then there's another possibility here, which is totalitarianism. Totalitarianism. And essentially totalitarianism is that you do what others want you to do. You do what others want you to do. In this case, we're doing what others want us to do. And that's essentially forcing. And by the way, you see both of these in grand scale today, man. How many of you are afraid to have certain conversations in your class because you're afraid of how people will react to what you have to say? If I want to piss off a class or scare a class, I'll say, hey, let's talk about transgenderism. Oh, sure. So which bathroom should people use? I don't know, Scanlon. Hey, who should have won homecoming queen last year? Now, it's understandable that there are reasonable positions on all sides of these things, but understand that just by mentioning that, we're terrified of speaking about it. That should alert us to something. That's an example of totalitarianism, that you're not doing what you want to do. You're not saying what you want to say, but you're doing what others want you to say, or what others want you to do. Even if it's just, to get along just to get along, so that you don't get shouted out of a class, or doxed online, or whatever, So you've got these two views that people, when we enter this existential vacuum, we no longer work off of instinct and tradition. And these are the things, by the way, that keep us together out of choice. Instead, we're on conformism, which is that we just do what others want us to do. It's like, all right, I guess I'll just do it. Or, I'm sorry, well, we want to do that. In other words, we choose to do that. We take the pictures and all that to fit in. And then the other side is doing what others want us to do, which is forcing us to do that. So far, so good? Okay.
What about solitude?
Solitude?
Yeah.
Oh man,
Is there like solitarianism or something like that?
Solitude.
if you're gonna live in solitude, I've said before, you need to either be a beast or a god. There's not a lot of in between there. It's difficult to live outside of those kinds of constraints. And so there is something to be said there, which I'm going to say in about 4 to 6 minutes. It's about Taoism. So far so good? Okay. So the product of this sort of a thing, this existential vacuum, is going to be what he refers to as the mass neurotic triad. Simple phrase, mass neurotic triad. So we can unpack that. What does mass mean? Lots of people. A triad? There's threes. And then we have this word neurotic, which we've talked a bit about neuroses, which is like a mental illness. So you've got mental illness that's caused by this one triad. And it looks like this. Essentially, you can tell me, you can ask yourself if this fits any of you guys. People start to suffer from depression. So when you start to conform or you're forced into something, we start to suffer from depression. We're no longer free to express ourselves, and we're no longer free to be who we want to be. Or even if we do make that choice, we're making the choice for those wrong reasons. So it leads to depression. Also, addiction. So people will turn to drugs, alcohol, exercise, earlier, porn, we're saying. And all of these sorts of addictions come from that because, it's like, well, screw it, why not, right?
I think I have a case of mass neurotic triad.
Oh, I would suggest that most of you do. I would suggest that most of us do. Because think about it, that's a way. Because what's the point of addiction? What are you trying to do? What's that?
Conceal something.
Yeah, conceal something, and also to escape from it. How do you? Why is it that you think people who are homeless use a lot of drugs and alcohol? Oh, they probably got there by using drugs and alcohol. They also probably suffer from a lot of mental illness, which we do know. But also, well, goodness, imagine if that was your existence. You lived on the street wearing the same clothes every day. People not even wanting to look at you in the eye, pretend like you don't exist. Think about the absolute, personal hatred that even grows from something like that. Well, it's no surprise. I don't know, imagine if any of us were homeless, I wonder if we'd ever be sober. Because you're trying to escape that reality that you're living in. And so that's what he's talking about here. People become addicted to these things because we're trying to escape this reality that is just absolutely horrible, that we feel trapped inside of. And all of the things I just mentioned, alcohol, drugs, we were talking earlier, porn, all of these things help us to escape from that neuroses. Well, we think it does. All it does, of course, is conceal the thing that we're trying to escape from. And then lastly, you also see it expressed through aggression. Depression, addiction, and aggression. And you can kind of tell me for yourself if how well those things go for you. When you're, so now you're angry, depressed, and addicted. Yeah. I'm talking about my dad there, It's a joke. That's like last period, I always make those comments like, someone, goes to the learning center, I'm like, you're never coming back, just like my dad. But I knew my dad my whole life until he died. He was with me when I was growing up. I just say that because I think it's funny. You can imagine if there's an afterlife, my dad's up there just like, shut up! Stop telling people that! So if you guys ever died and met him, oh yeah, Scanlon told me about you. It was all a lie. So these are all symptoms. These are all symptoms. So these are not the problems themselves. And a lot of times we're trying to treat depression, but if you remember from what we were talking about last time, quote, depression is not the problem, it's the symptom. Addiction is not the problem, it's the symptom. It's a symptom.
They treat depression with drugs, which cause them to get addicted, which cause them to get angry.
Beautiful. And he's going to talk about that we treat depression with drugs, which then turn people and make them aggressive, make them angry, and these kinds of things. Absolutely. He does mention that at some point here. But these are all symptoms, he says, of existing in what he calls of existing in the existential vacuum. If you find yourself depressed and addicted and angry, and by the way, again, addiction can be lots of things. It's not just going to be drugs and alcohol. Anything that you're doing perpetually to try to escape from a reality is going to be something like that, And that these are all symptoms, he says, of existing in this existential vacuum. Existential, of course, relates to existence, and then this vacuum, essentially, the sense of meaninglessness. And so, if you feel purposeless, and if you feel like your life has no meaning, well, then yeah. What other reaction is there but depression? I'll tell you, there's two other reactions to it. Addiction, to try to escape the truth of that, and then aggression, to be angry about it. And by the way, you see this happening with a lot of mass shooters. You see this happen with the Columbine shooters. You had goodness gracious, you had one of them wearing a t-shirt that said natural selection on it. Why? Because these are, and you can see from their videos, they left a whole catalog of videos behind explaining why they're doing what they were doing. And a large part of it, and it reflects most other mass shooters, is this idea that humanity is ugly, humanity is terrible, it's weak, it's this, it's that, and so therefore, I've decided, I am the judge of all existence. And I have found existence to be, existence itself, and being itself, to be lacking, to be wanting. I've weighed and measured existence, and it's lacking. I get to decide that. So of course there's a hell of a lot of narcissism that goes along with this as well. But goodness gracious, if you think that we're all alone in this universe and life is meaningless and all that, yeah, it's easy to become angry. You're pissed off that you're ever even born. Why do I have to live this life of suffering? Just, why? Damn it, why? So screw it. I'm depressed about that, so then I turn to something to try to get me out of that cycle. So Frankl is recognizing this all as a significant problem, going through. So, questions so far?
But isn't it when you're depressed, your brain is chemically imbalanced, right?
Yeah.